Okay, so this event is co-organized by IEEE Young Professionals in Ottawa and some other sections like Windsor, London, Vancouver, and Women in Engineering, and also MTT APP chapter and Carleton University. As you may know, IEEE Young Professionals is the group of IEEE members and volunteers who have graduated from the first professional degree within the past 15 years. And if you would like to participate and become a volunteer, you're most welcome to join. Now, I'd like to basically briefly introduce our great speaker, Professor Halim Yanikomeroglu, and whom I had the pleasure to do my PhD with him. And of course, I know that if I would like to introduce him, it will take more than an hour. So I'll make it very short. Professor Halim Yanikomeroglu is a full professor at Carleton University. His research interests cover many aspects of wireless communications and networks, with a special emphasis on non-terrestrial networks in the recent years. Dr. Yanikomeroglu is a fellow of the IEEE, the Engineering Institute of Canada, and the Canadian Academy of Engineering. He is a distinguished speaker for the IEEE Communications Society and the IEEE Vehicular Technology Society, and an expert panelist of the Council of Canadian Academics. Professor Yanikomeroglu, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Monireh. I am in the process of sharing my screen.
Yes, just one thing, if you would like the audience, if you have any questions, you can just type your questions in the chat, and after the professor is done with the presentation, we can go by order. Thank you.
Monireh, you see the full screen, right?
Yes, we do.
Yes. Well, thank you, Monireh, for the generous introduction. You said it would take an hour, but I hope with positive remarks. You didn't say positive or negative memories, perhaps. Just kidding. We had a great period together when you were at Carleton, and I'm very happy to see you are moving forward in your career with leadership positions in IEEE Young Professionals. It is always a good feeling to be with the younger professionals. I am already outside that window. I also put IEEE ComSoc and VTS logos on top of my slide deck. I'm a distinguished speaker for both societies, and once again, thank you for the opportunity. I also have this acknowledgement remark. These are what I will present today is not something that occurred to me last weekend. Rather, it is decades of thinking on some fundamental concepts, primarily the architecture of radio access. And I had the privilege to work with quite a number of collaborators, whether faculty, postdoctoral fellow, graduate student, and so on. So in that sense, it is a collective effort. We will talk about a new network architecture, which includes a stratosphere. There is little activity in stratosphere, therefore uncharted territory title, except for recent awareness, the Chinese balloon saga, as they call. Last month, this was in media in the US and Canada. You see different pictures from media. The term balloon is a little bit dismissive. This is not like your niece's or nephew's birthday balloon. This is really huge, and its payload can also be quite sizable. As you see, it is as big as the Opera House of Sydney, and it can lift a lot of equipment, and that can be used. And that equipment can be used for purposes other than even connectivity. I will unpack this slide further in a variety of ways. Suffice to say at the moment is that this object, actually it has a more technical name that I will use. It is an high altitude platform station, HAPS. It is positioned in stratosphere between 20 to 50 kilometers, well above the transatlantic flights. So that was a very brief introduction, and here is the agenda. Any wireless talk these days, you as a presenter, I feel almost compelled to position that with respect to 6G, but as I will argue, it's not a really good idea to position this work or this vision with 6G. It will become obvious. I will talk about HAPS networks, and from connectivity viewpoint, I will make a case that this is indeed an architecture which has great promise. It is a big infrastructure project. Based on time, I will get into some research areas, and then I will conclude with forward-looking remarks. My talk time is about 50 minutes to an hour. So I plan to finish by 1 p.m. Eastern time. And then those of you who can stay, I would be more than happy to have further Q&A. This 5G to 6G roadmap chart is from 3GPP website. I don't want to get into details, but long story short, very soon, very soon here, meaning a couple of years, in few years, we are expected to have the 6G standard. The current thinking is that release 21 will most likely be 6G. But from the timeline viewpoint, as a matter of fact, ITU will release, it is IMT 2030 and beyond vision, that is the 6G vision, in just few months, June 2023. So many of the important elements of 6G will already be out in just few months. Therefore, for all these reasons, if you have a really forward-looking paradigm, like a network in stratosphere, 6G is just way too close for this paradigm. If I look at the main drivers for 6G research, we have a number of them, including non-terrestrial networks paradigm, which really means an integrated terrestrial satellite network. And when the time comes for beyond 6G discussions, I would argue that one of the main drivers would be now an integrated, a more sophisticated network. Not only there is the terrestrial element and space element. By the way, space element is already there. I was showing in the previous slide LEO mega constellations. But the point is that today, space network is not integrated with terrestrial network. So when we say NTN, there is an emphasis for integration, which is a loaded word. But as we move forward, we will have this another layer, and that is the stratosphere. Let us start the discussion with HAPS. This is ITU's definition, high altitude platform station. It's also known as high altitude pseudo satellite. It is a station mounted to an object. That object is some sort of an aircraft in stratosphere, that is between altitudes 20 to 50 kilometers. Having said that, most connectivity projects focus on the lower end of altitude stratosphere, that's 20 kilometers. And this is at a fixed point relative to Earth. Very important. Unlike satellites, HAPS does not orbit. Either it stays where it is, pretty much, or if the aircraft type is a glider, as you see here, Zephyr project of Airbus, then it makes figure-8 movements in a radius of, say, about 2 kilometers. Other aircraft types include a Zeppelin, for instance, European Thales's Stratobus concept, or a balloon like Chinese balloon, or I should say really a sophisticated balloon like Alphabet's Loon project, which got terminated about 2 years ago. To give you once again a perspective, this picture is not to the scale. HAPS is only 20 kilometers above the ground, while LEOs start around about 500 kilometers. So much closer than LEOs. HAPS as a concept has several decades of history to provide connectivity. Even in ITU, the history goes back to 1990s. World Radio Conference, one after another, ITU is dedicated spectrum for this application. The reason is that ITU has been a believer in HAPS as an enabler for rural and remote coverage. Now, the term dedicated spectrum is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is a lot of new spectrum other than terrestrial, the spectrum used by terrestrial networks, that is the IMT network in ITU jargon. But when there is different spectrum, it means different equipment, different air interface, basically a different user terminal. And that is not very good for penetration. And also, more recently, the great success of LEO mega constellations, starting with Starlink, raises a question whether, in particular in remote coverage, there is a viable business case for HAPS. For these reasons and a number of other reasons which will become apparent, a couple of years ago, I started thinking about a vertical headnet. I used this term for the first time in this Transactions on Wireless Communications paper, a multi-tier heterogeneous network, multi-tier in the sense that it is, in addition to small base stations and macro base stations, now we also have what I called super macro base stations. And this is an NTN, obviously. However, the way we envisioned is that this super macro base station is just an extension of the terrestrial network. Therefore, super macro base station is native to our design. We made, or since late 2019, had quite a number of work and publications in this area. And now I am happy to see that the term VHATNet is used in the literature by other researchers as well. I will come back to this slide. Once again, the vision can be extended further, including an integrated network with satellites as well. And in that case, there will be multiple tiers of satellites, LEOs, MEOs, and GEOs. However, I would like to emphasize that the way I see this is Stratosphere is much easier to integrate due to proximity and due to the fact that HAPS does not orbit. It is much more feasible to integrate with the terrestrial network to the extent that I consider HAPS as an extension of the terrestrial network. And sometimes this vision is also expressed as a 3D network. Here is a HAPS. This is an artist's rendition, but it is very similar to Stratobus concept of Airbus. And it has a number of salient features. Once again, this is very close to Earth. When you look up, it looks like, you know, way above, but mind you that certain LTE preamble formats allow cell sizes much bigger than 20 kilometers. And 20 kilometers in comparison to 500 kilometers, 25 times closer to the Earth in comparison to a LEO. And with free space path laws, that makes about 14 dB. 14 dB is huge in link budget. That creates many opportunities. As I said, this is non-orbiting. All the difficulties tracking a satellite with a, for instance, Starlink dish that literally moves with mechanical gear is not necessary here. And this is huge. Stratobus concept has a lift capability of half a ton. As we move forward, tons of equipment can be mounted in this big bird. And once you have access to that much equipment, you can do much more than connectivity, as we will discuss. And imagine now I bring this big bird to the skies of metro areas, to the cities, then really what you can do is limited with your imagination. Just 2 years ago, we had this paper, a vision and framework for HAPS networks of the future, published in Communication Surveys and Tutorials. It is a 50+ page paper, arguably the most comprehensive and visionary paper discussing this concept. Once again, once you talk about HAPS, people who are familiar with ITU thinks that, oh, we heard about that. Very true. But what we are here talking about is quite different than ITU HAPS concept. Well, rural and remote is an extension, but this discussion is mainly for urban and suburban areas. We envision an integrated network, tightly integrated with terrestrial network working on an harmonized spectrum, one air interface, one device, one network. That is, your device is connected to a macro base station or a super macro base station opportunistically. A view graph from one of our magazine papers. You can have a standalone HAPS or a cluster of HAPS. And this architecture facilitates many use cases, whether these are highways for cargo drones, that is their connectivity needs, or providing hotspots with pencil beam antennas, or a wide area coverage for IoT, or backhauling some small cells, you name it. However, as we said, it doesn't stop at connectivity. These HAPS base stations can have edge connectivity or edge intelligence, I should have said. It can have certain functionalities of a data center. It creates a sustainable network that I will allude to in the coming slides. It is much more green and cost efficient. It is resilient. I don't have time to unpack all these words, but we all know the devastating earthquake in Syria and Turkey a couple of weeks ago. And in that very large region in Turkey, out of 8,900 base stations, mostly mounted on top of buildings, 1/3 collapsed. And the fact that the terrestrial network becomes unfunctional had a big impact in the first 48 hours in rescue efforts. And you can imagine the consequences. If we had a HAPS in that region or as an extra layer, this wouldn't have impacted from the earthquake, for instance. And then surveillance, monitoring, sensing, localization, and so on and so forth. Without derailing the discussion too much, I am thinking that in future, vehicles will not need front and back license plates, but the license plates will have to be mounted on the rooftop. And then imagine a city like Toronto, there cannot be any traffic infringement anywhere. No parking in a wrong spot, or speeding because your HAPS can watch you with very powerful cameras, literally 24/7. And even the implications of that is just enormous. Another motivational slide, again, think a metro area, whether this is Toronto or Shanghai or Istanbul or Tehran in the skies. So it's a big city, 20 million or plus, a cluster of HAPS interconnected with super high rate free space optical links. They create a distributed massive MIMO architecture, and then based on the needs, it can have a very wide beam, or if we can create a 0.2 degree beam width, that will create a hotspot on the ground. And then this cluster, the Toronto cluster, might be connected to nearby Buffalo cluster and say Kingston cluster, and all of that to the satellite network. This is a vertical head net. Here we are talking about a real infrastructure project with access, backhaul, edge, and so on. Good for communications, computing, sensing, navigation, and so on. I think that as we move towards 2050s, it is possible that we might have up to perhaps 100,000 HAPS worldwide. Every metro type area, every city can have HAPS, and then a more sparse network in the rural areas. This will really be transformative. As I mentioned, since 2011, in my group, we have been looking at this picture from a number of angles. HAPS first as a super macro base station, this communications magazine paper from 2 years ago, combining or mounting reconfigurable surfaces at HAPS. I will talk a little bit more about this line of work. And then the management of this sophisticated network through AI, ML, we call this a self-evolving management architecture. Another dimension is HAPS as an enabler for intelligent transportation systems. That is this work, for instance, which came out recently, and Professor Wael Jafar is with us today. HAPS facilitating aerial highways, a number of magazine papers in this area, looking at this picture from sustainability viewpoint, and quite a number of other papers. These are all visionary, less technical, but brainstorming type of papers, trying to stimulate research in this area. Now, let me try to make a case for this stratospheric network from a connectivity viewpoint, and later I will take the discussion for use cases beyond connectivity. Take the Toronto map as an example for a second. Generation after generation, our motto is anytime, anywhere, affordable, high rates, or KPIs, whatever those KPIs are. Now, I have to open a parenthesis for fairness. Rate itself is a moving target. In the beginning, we were talking about 10 kilobits per second voice, but in 2030s, there will be many applications that might require gigabits per second connectivity. So I have to register that for fairness. A few features of the traffic, the demand in space and time. This demand is quite dynamic, and it is inhomogeneous, and to some extent unpredictable. For instance, imagine 2030s, maybe this is a self-driving vehicle. Each user is in immersed reality situation requiring gigabit per second connectivity. There are 100 of them. this vehicle, this bus can move anywhere. It may be difficult to provide 100 gigabits per second all the time to this bus, unless you put a base station everywhere. On the other hand, supply, that is my infrastructure, is quite static. Here I am showing a heat map of spectral efficiency. If you are very close to base station, you get good spectral efficiency, good rate, and often we are in higher end of the spectrum, millimeter wave to start with, which is very vulnerable with respect to obstructions. So as long as there is a building between you and the base station, spectral efficiency goes down substantially. So demand is dynamic, to some extent predictable, but supply is static. So here on the left side, I am showing the demand. This white is a bus. This is a snapshot. If I just progress in time, bus will be moving. Bus will be close to a base station at certain times. That is good. At some other times, it will be at a low spectral efficiency situation. How do you handle this situation? Very difficult from infrastructure viewpoint. Now, you might be saying that, hey, the network is getting densified. That is true, and densification will continue. However, it is taking place at different intensities. The way densification happens in core downtown in Toronto is very different than the residential areas. By the way, I am here not talking about rural or anything like that. It is just a couple of kilometers away from downtown core. You can't, in downtown, you can put a base station every 100 meters, but not in residential areas. So your bus, when it is passing downtown, unless there is congestion due to very high demand, probably from at least signal strength viewpoint, we are good. But when it comes to the periphery, then you have a problem. Now, imagine the situation when you go to rural. I'm not even talking about that yet. So what we do today is we have a brute force solution. Put base stations, small base stations everywhere. This is a worst case design. That is, at any given time, statistically, I am close to a base station. The consequence of which is that most of the time, most of the base stations are sitting there with idle capacity. A very bad design, actually. So my bus moves, so it is always close to a base station, but very many of them are staying pretty much idle. Once again, this is over-engineering, over-provisioning, high CapEx and OpEx, and not only that this is bad for environment, but this high investment also hurts me as a user due to high connection fees. All of this is clearly not aligned with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Moving forward, I need an efficient, agile, sustainable architecture. Now, if you have a very quick look at the history of access network, certainly a lot has changed. Here, this picture is from the GSM days with channel assignment through a color map. Today, in our toolkit, we have a lot, both for radio access network possibilities, whether it is distributed antenna systems, cloud RAN, or radio resource management techniques. However, interestingly, no matter what we do, the access network is still not sufficiently agile. A number of years ago, thinking on this concept, I proposed in ICC 2010-15 an integrated network, integrated with terrestrial network and UAV base stations. The concept of UAV base station is not new, but here the key is working this in an integrated manner. And in this example, rather than densifying the terrestrial network with different type of base stations in a blind manner, and in a campus example, rather than putting 100 base stations, perhaps it is wiser to put 60 base stations on the ground and augment this with 10 moving base stations, flying base stations, under the assumption that the capex and opex of Monireh, actually, you can maybe mute. Okay, I just mute Sarah. So here, under the assumption that the cost of one UAV base station is cheaper than 4 terrestrial base stations, capex, opex included. I presented this in the first time, again, almost 8 years ago. Our first paper came out the following year, Irem Boryalanas and Amr El-Kei, efficient 3D placement of an aerial base station in next generation cellular networks. Not only that, this paper is the most cited paper among 1,000 plus papers in that ICC, but I believe this is the most cited ICC paper ever, perhaps at least in the last 15 years, to which there are IEEE Explore records. So it was an instant hit, and we did a lot of work in this area with other researchers, and interestingly, much earlier than my expectation, Release 17, which was out last year, embraced this concept as a UXNB, that is UAV and B, node B, that is base station, X is and suitable air interface. Let us move on. The work in my group on UAV base stations is still continuing. It's still a very hot area, and I am confident that this concept will come. Having said all these things, I am now thinking about something even more agile. For instance, if there is a need, if there is a stress in the ground network, it will take a while for the UAV base station to come. And UAVs cannot fly in the city cluster, flight time is limited, weather conditions are an issue, so on and so forth. How about to put a HAPS as a super macro base station with lots and lots of beams in the form of a 3D massive MIMO, which can be turned on and off instantaneously, anytime, anywhere. So this big bird has the aggregated capacity of hundreds of base stations. Think them akin to sectors of the old cellular architecture. And whenever you have need, the lights in that analogy are turned on and off. The need is absorbed, and then you just turn off that light, that is that beam. No energy is wasted. So once again, centralized massive capacity utilized wherever and whenever there is a need. With that design, in this metro area, I can have different size beams based on the capacity needs. For IoT, big beams; for high capacity food hotspots, smaller beams, and they are dynamic. This green dot is my bus, which requires 100 gigabits per second connectivity, and as you know, the beam follows that. Beams within beams, they appear, disappear instantaneously. As you can imagine, a nightmare from interference viewpoint. We have to manage that. If I can do a very quick back of the envelope calculation, if I have access to 10 gigahertz of spectrum, including the millimeter wave band, and with an average spectral efficiency of 4, and with 1,000 beams, with a 1/4 reuse for interference management between the beams, it is possible to achieve a mind-boggling 10 terabits per second. And actually, if I can accommodate more beams, like 10,000 beams, capacity might increase to 100 terabits per second. Now, some of you might be thinking that these numbers are way too high to believe. However, they are within the scope of how base station rate is evolving. Pretty much since 3G, every generation, we have seen about 2 orders of magnitude increase in rate. And now 6G, we are talking about terabits per second hotspots. And just I'm projecting that to 7G era. Therefore, it is not outrageous to think about terabits per second super macro base stations. By the way, I am making these predictions not out of nowhere. I am now turning my attention for a quick second to the satellite world. These huge geosatellites actually can have terabits per second connectivity even today. ViaSat-3 will be launched later this decade, later this year, 2023, and it will have 1 terabits per second capacity over 1,000 beams. So if these high throughput satellites are a possibility today at 36,000 kilometers away, why it is so surprising to have in 20 years' time much more powerful equipment at 20 kilometers height and create 100 terabits per second capacity. I think this is very doable. The key issue in this stratospheric network is that we have to use the very best practices, both from satellite industry as well as the terrestrial networks, because HAPS, its structure is in some ways similar to satellites, in some other way terrestrial base stations. And here comes, as we move forward to 2040s and beyond, the wireless infrastructure for a green and sustainable smart cities and societies. Again, take a mega city, a cluster of HAPS in the skies. Computation is powered by AI and at some point quantum. There are lots of sensors of all kinds on the ground, in the air, underground, and then architecture is this infrastructure, integrated infrastructure with HAPS at its core. This results in zero outage, lots of redundancy, intentional there, even if there is a tsunami, God forbid, the space or the stratospheric element is not impacted. Zero setup time. These beams are instantaneous on and off, and everything is autonomous as much as possible. It is zero touch. A good example is the upcoming NEOM city in Saudi Arabia. It is almost $1 trillion investment announced, a linear city, and I am thinking that HAPS will be a big enabler for the connectivity and other needs of this futuristic city. Before I move to the next section, a few more slides. Imagine a concert in the outskirts of Ottawa in Gatineau Park, just for one afternoon or evening, tens of thousands of people. How do you give connectivity and computing needs, edge computing for that many users in the middle of pretty much nowhere for a very short time? I mean, today we bring trucks with base stations mounted, but that is really your grandparents' way of doing things. If I have this HAPS architecture, I can provide that capacity for without really wasting any resources. It is very large surface area and heavy payload and a bird's eye line of sight view of a large area, HAPS comes with lots of opportunities. First of all, it is sustainable in the sense that my resources, whether it is antennas, whether it is spectrum, whether it is computing, storage, they are all shared. And this allows a one-shot operation, whether it is hands-off, free, connected and autonomous vehicles on the ground or in the air, as I mentioned, for centimeter level positioning. And by the way, we have a lot of work going on federated learning with HAPS. It seems to be a great enabler. And imagine a digital twin of this concert area, for instance. It is ideal to construct this digital twin by data gathered at HAPS in one shot, rather than collecting data from smaller base stations and fusing them, stitching them together. As I am repeating myself, really here the imagination is the limit. The goal is a green and sustainable architecture and infrastructure. And this is basically 6G will be too soon for this vision, but progressively in 2030s, we will be having this discussion in a more tangible way. Now, HAPS research areas. At Carleton University, with my team, with my industrial collaborators and academic collaborators, we are trying to progress in these 12 different streams. Today I will not have time to get into all of these. I just, for instance, mentioned the sustainability angle. I mentioned, for instance, digital twins, and I will talk a little bit about reconfigurable intelligent surfaces. Cybersecurity is huge. Opportunities are huge, but vulnerability is also huge. If your HAPS infrastructure is vulnerable, then nothing will work for sure. People often ask me, you can obviously do research from very different angles, but what are the big ticket items? The big ticket items are 4 in my view, current view, and one of them is cybersecurity, which I forgot to highlight. In an integrated network, interference management will be huge. And this will be done through sophisticated legacy techniques, but also increasingly AI, ML enabled. And antenna architectures will play a very big role. I am thinking that we will have a big rejuvenation in antenna research, because HAPS area, these stratospheric platforms, will require types of antennas different than what we have on the ground. Then the control and management of this sophisticated network in an integrated manner is also extremely important. You can build it only if you can control and manage and orchestrate, obviously. There are also quite a number of non-ICT types of important points which has to be discussed, and some of these are even more important than ICT elements. For instance, building an endurable aircraft. These balloons, as a matter of fact, the Chinese balloon, as they say, create quite a bit of visibility for this area. But as we understand from the media, that balloon drifted. It means that there is some issue with the control of the aircraft. The loitering time is important. Where will energy come from? And then policy regulations, including spectrum allocation. These things are very slowly evolving areas, and they all will have to be tackled one by one in a progressive manner. If I just go to architecture and, the aircraft endurance, There are different types of aircrafts. Some of them are operational as a pilot, and some others are artist's rendition. One popular design is a glider, but of course, a huge glider, maybe wingspan approaching 60 meters or even 100 meters, all also utilized for retrieving energy from sun. However, the glider type has the least lift capability. The design which has the highest lift capability is the Zeppelin type, as they call, well, anyhow, it is a type of blimp. And at the end of the day, this is similar to a balloon. I always hesitate to use the term balloon because this is really a sophisticated balloon. And the balloon might be carrying a capsule. This is exactly the design of the Chinese balloon we have seen in the media. That capsule can be very large. You know, this is an artist's rendition, but as you can imagine, this can house tons of equipment actually, and you can do a lot with that equipment. Another type of design is an uncrewed airplane. And this is, for instance, the project by SPL and in conjunction with, now I forgot the name of the other company. Yeah, Cambridge Consultants from the UK and SPL. So when we have a plane, they are at least arguing for hydrogen fuel rather than retrieving this from the sun. And this hydrogen fuel can pump 20 kilowatt of power to a very sophisticated massive MIMO structure, which can create 480 individually steerable beams. Just let me change the attention or to energy issue. A 5G base station with a modest layer of MIMO requires a bit over 10 kilowatts of power. As I understand, it is possible even today with some of these aircrafts to retrieve through photovoltaic cells this much power. However, as our vision includes more and more processing, AI, and so on, edge computing, you will certainly need much more energy. And where will that come from? Certainly, the battery technologies are progressing, whether it is next generation lithium-ion batteries, fluoride iron batteries, hydrogen fuel, as mentioned. And an interesting solution might be, as a matter of fact, battery replacement, similar to aerial in-flight refueling of jet fighters. So if I have a HAPS cluster, there might be a shuttle of some sort of UAVs continuously bringing up and down batteries. But let me park that discussion there and let us move to more ICT-related discussions and use cases. My playing with stratospheric networks, as a matter of fact, started a number of years ago with a work done in collaboration with my colleague, Professor Aluni, and Professor Zishan Shakir and Mohammed Al-Zanat. At the time, we thought about backhauling small base stations, as fiber is not coming to everywhere, through a HAPS network. So HAPS in this case is some sort of a relay. There is a hybrid FSO RF link just shooting upwards to a HAPS, then the signal is moved to an Earth gateway. I think this paper was the very first paper in the literature which articulated a HAPS urban scenario. Up to that point, HAPS has always been envisioned as a rural remote connectivity solution. This paper received the IEEE Fred Ellersig Best Paper Prize. Now, a few words on interference management. This is the legacy ITU vision. A rural or remote area is served by a HAPS and there is no terrestrial network. Therefore, there is no interference between terrestrial network and HAPS. There will be interference between the beams of HAPS, and that is perhaps manageable. However, ITU is moving towards a harmonized spectrum. Later this year in the World Radio Conference, some low-band spectrum will be identified with operations in areas surrounding the metro areas. The name in ITU for this concept is HAPS, HAPS as an IMT base station. And this is the scenario. For instance, imagine Ottawa. In the city, terrestrial network serves a user, but that user just moves 50 kilometers outside of Ottawa to the cottage country, and there is no terrestrial network. It is served by HAPS. But due to the geographic proximity, HAPS interference will leak into the rural area. So some sort of interference management will be necessary, although there is no intentional overlap. Now, the situation will become much more complicated when HAPS footprint and the terrestrial network overlap. This is the real VHATNet scenario I'm talking about. Eventually, small cells, macro cells, and super macro cell, and everything interfering with each other. We have quite a bit of research ongoing. Our first paper in this area came out just recently, and a number of others under review. As you can imagine, this HAPS architecture is an absolute 100% fit for cell edge capacity concern, because no matter how intensify your terrestrial network, the spectral efficiency map is never uniform. There are always users in between two base stations. But from HAPS, pretty much all outdoor users are equidistant, whether it is 20 kilometers or 22 kilometers, path loss is same for all practical purposes. This is a cell edge-free design. I already mentioned Cambridge consultants and SPL backed by Deutsche Telekom and their giant antenna architecture. This is telling you that antenna design, whether for capacity or interference management, is very big in this domain. And here, as you see, a cluster or a number of HAPS are giving coverage to parts of UK. Actually, this initiative argues that they can cover the entire UK with about 60 HAPS. These are some recent pictures from some recent papers from Japanese SoftBank, an interesting cylindrical antenna design with a number of benefits. And at Carleton University in my group, we also have quite a bit of work. Our first piece of work will be submitted soon in a novel antenna architecture for HAPS. Now, something very interesting. I will wrap up in the next 5 minutes. There is a lot happening in terms of architectures in the space domain. In particular, there is this AST Space Mobile startup. It's now a very big startup, actually. They are planning to deploy gigantic antenna arrays at LEO orbit, about 400 kilometers. They already put this 8 meter by 8 meter, 64 meter square array at around 400 kilometers just a few months ago, November 2022. And imagine the plans for a 900 meter square array. The next generation Starlink satellites are also have much bigger antennas. This is a view of AST Mobile, big antenna structure. Now, if this is happening at 400 kilometers with a satellite, I am thinking that can't we have this antenna architecture lifted or mounted to a Zeppelin at 20 kilometers, even bigger? Just changing the discussion, a paper with Professor Wael Jafar, most of the population in many geographies are around an transcontinental highway. That is the case in Canada and also Australia and other parts of the world. What about having a linear HAPS architecture from Pacific to Atlantic Canada, and 80% of the population can also be served around that highway. The population around that highway, what I mean is about 80% of the Canadian population. And then edge computing through HAPS. This is an ongoing research area. We have our first paper out very recently, and here part of the caching and computational offloading by connected and autonomous vehicles, in part done by roadside units, but keep in mind that there is a lot of handoff. So for tasks which are less time sensitive, in particular related to control plane, they can be offloaded to HAPS, which can see tens of kilometers of a highway. And more recent work under review, it is possible for these connected vehicles to go from one city to another without any handoff, actually, when it comes to the control plane functionalities. HAPS is good for aerial highways as well. We have a number of magazine papers in this area. Aerial highways are a very interesting construct. It is just a matter of time, and UAV traffic management can be moved to HAPS. HAPS would be the ideal vehicle in a way, or ideal mode of operation to provide connectivity to these aerial highways of the future. I already mentioned this localization, navigation, and positioning. We have a line of research here. Our work is showing that if the current GNSS, global navigation satellite system, is augmented with HAPS nodes, and then with 5G or 6G terrestrial network, and mind you that 5G air interface allows localization functionalities to quite an extent. However, it's difficult to find a sufficient number of anchor nodes. But if you put a couple of HAPS in the skies of a metro area, at any given instant, a outdoor user will be seeing a few anchor HAPS. So you will be having 4 or 5 or more very reliable links to do centimeter level accuracy, especially in the vertical domain, which is getting increasingly important in UAV control and management. Our first paper received the Best Paper Award in WYSI a couple of months ago, and journal papers are just out or under their way. Well, almost done. Reconfigurable intelligent surfaces. This is a very hot area. How about utilizing them in drones, HAPS, and satellites? While drones, their surface area is very small. Satellites might have bigger surface area, but they are very far away. It turns out that HAPS may be the golden arrangement. It might have a gigantic surface area, and since energy efficiency is a concern, we might have, for instance, this paper under review, multimode HAPS for next generation wireless networks. If HAPS is not energy constrained, at certain times it can create a ultramassive MIMO. In some other times, at least part of the energy is taken away from massive MIMO or saved. It uses a smaller antenna architecture, but it can utilize a very big reconfigurable surface. And this has many advantages. We are exploring this area in an increased level of sophistication. And this paper received the grand prize in the IEEE 2022 NTN competition. And then my final slide before concluding remarks, the management and control of this network is, of course, extremely sophisticated and can be complicated. This self-evolving network management paradigm that we advanced relies on AI and ML. And you see some papers from 2 years ago and literally from a few weeks ago. Let me conclude my presentation. What are we talking about? Well, we are talking about a new network infrastructure with a big presence in stratosphere. And this is not a single technology. It is a potpourri of very many technologies put together, and the opportunities seem to be unprecedented, from positioning to surveillance to connectivity. Now, if you think that this is a bit awkward, I am asking you back why it is awkward. This is already happening in space. If 10 years ago, if we are told that there will be a satellite mega constellation in 2023 with 3,500 satellites, that would be hard to believe. And we know that the number of Starlink satellites will increase likely to more than 7,000 LEOs later this decade, and perhaps even up to 42,000 in the next decade. So this discussion is coming behind the LEO discussions, because interestingly, aircraft endurance is a bigger problem here. However, it is just coming, and it is indeed doable. What we really need is big entrepreneurs who may make investment in this area and expedite research. It is not accidental that some of the world's richest persons are investing in space because there are big opportunities there. And one proposal I have to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos is that you are perhaps investing $50 billion over a decade to put up, say, 10,000 LEOs. They pass through big cities, and smartphones cannot reach to these satellites because link cannot be closed in link budget. Why don't you invest another few $1 billion and equip the skies of every big city with HAPS, and HAPS can act as relays and bring the capacity of those satellites to the end users on the ground. By this way, you can reach out to the urban population, at least 2 billion people, and there is a lot of money there. As I mentioned, with my team at Carleton and with my collaborators, we are trying to look at this work from very many angles. Some of them I mentioned, some of them there was no time, but federated learning is big. As you see, we have a number of papers under review in that area. Cell-free is also very big. We have a number of papers under review. Intelligent transportation systems, and the list goes on and on. All these publications are available at my website. If you found this discussion interesting, then let us talk further. You will find me in internet. I would be very happy to extend this discussion and to engage in possible collaborations. Let me stop sharing actually, so that we can have some Q&A.
Okay, Thank you very much, Professor Halim, for the astonishing talk, which, as always, expands our horizon. Now, maybe we have only 5 minutes for Q&A, and if you have further questions, you can either directly reach the professor, or you can reach us and we can forward your questions to him.
It is not a very big crowd. We give priority to the mic first. It's a bit difficult for me to read the chat questions anyway. So if anyone would like to unmute herself or himself, maybe that's a good, yeah.
Sure. Or maybe I can ask Paul. He has several questions, but maybe first 2 or 3 questions. You only have 5 minutes, and the rest you can probably continue later. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Paul, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, Dr. Yanikomeroglu, how are you?
Halim, call me Halim. It's a simpler.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So I guess the first question is you were talking about interference. What are the sources of interference?
Right. Today, well, the way ITU envisioned HAPS and satellites, the frequency bands allocated are different than those for IMT frequencies. IMT refers to terrestrial networks, 3G, 4G, 5G, that business. So today, Starlink is passing by, and maybe, at any given point, maybe there are at least 10 Starlink satellites I should be able to see, and they are transmitting to maybe some users outside Ottawa, but there is no interference to my smartphone because it is different frequencies, different air interface. So in ITU historic vision of rural and remote connectivity from stratosphere and space, there is no interference with terrestrial network. And actually, due to that reason, these areas evolve separately. There is a separate ecosystem in ITU, 3GPP, and then there is a very separate ecosystem for satellites. But when we are talking about the vision in which, where is my smartphone here? So this smartphone talks to a macro base station, to a HAPS opportunistically in a seamless manner. Now we are using the same frequency. So HAPS on top of Ottawa, for instance, it sees the entire city, while in my connection to HAPS, it is also causing interference, supposedly, to 100 macro cells on the ground, if not more. So this is a very complicated interference situation. Therefore, in ITU discussions, I sometimes attend as a delegate, as a member of WWRF, Wireless World Research Forum, HAPS as an IMT base station is a big concept there. But some operators are supporting, some operators are very concerned. They basically say that, look, we invested over decades hundreds of billions of dollars on the terrestrial network. And then now you are talking about HAPS, maybe a new company bringing a HAPS on top of this infrastructure, and it is an interference shower. It might kill our network if not managed properly. So basically, that is what I mean by interference. Just to wrap up in a different way, this is in a way similar to interference in a traditional headnet between small cell and macro cell, but times 100, if I may say. Does that explain the interference concern?
Yes, thank you. May I ask a second question?
Of course.
The second question is, from a young professional perspective, how can we get involved and start to develop skills and knowledge in this field?
This field is very multidisciplinary, and there is research going on from disciplines, in disciplines, other side, my comfort zone, let us say material science is very big in HAPS aircraft design. Those Zeppelins, for instance, that I have shown, they are constructed by very special material, which wouldn't have been imaginable 10 years ago. But if we come to ICT area, that is presumably your domain as well, and my domain, I am approaching this from an architecture viewpoint, and my viewpoint is this. This is the same old question I have been thinking from my master's back in early 90s, more than 30 years ago. And the question is, how do you distribute and collect wireless signals? I mean, it is a no-brainer to put your base stations and take it from there. But let us keep in mind that the path loss can be easily 120 dB. That is 1 trillion times. So I am receiving an extremely minute version of the transmitted energy. And to make it worse, overwhelming majority of that signal escapes elsewhere and cause interference. So what is a good architecture? Therefore, we talk about Cloud RAN, we talk about small base stations, coordinated multi-point transmission and reception, radio resource management techniques. And I came to the conclusion that no matter what you do on the ground, it won't cut it. This architecture has to be more sophisticated with vertical elements in stratosphere and space, and things are evolving in that direction. Now, as I mentioned, one can look at this from the computing side, edge computing, edge intelligence, AI, ML is extremely important as enablers. The short answer is to be visionary. I try to train at least my research group at that regard. We shouldn't lock ourselves to incremental gains in well-established legacy techniques, which are very important, by the way. When we are talking about $1 trillion network, even if you come up with a technique which gives you 0.2 dB advantage, that may mean actually hundreds of millions of dollars in the ecosystem, which is very valuable. But the big picture is really much bigger than these things. So for young professionals, being visionary is important. And for that, in addition to depth, you have to have breadth. To have the breadth, attend talks of this sort, panels, keynotes, YouTube videos. I always try to stimulate myself by watching in my spare time YouTube videos on some futuristic technologies. I think all of these are important, and we should not be really scared about being forward thinking. I guess Monireh was making like this. Did I see it correctly? So I think it's time to stop.
It's fine. Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you, Paul, for questions. And we are sorry that we do not have more time, basically. So if you have any more questions, you can directly reach Professor, or you can reach us on LinkedIn or Instagram or on our website, directly message to us, and we will convey your message to our great speaker. Thanks again, Professor, and thanks everyone for being a great audience, and hope to see you in future events. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.